we do have here this session on tax governance and justice in Europe and beyond. And we would like to introduce today to our speakers, Professor Attiya Waris. She is a professor of fiscal law at the University of Nairobi, no longer director of research, and she is not speaking on her UN capacity, so she will also say that. We also have Frederik Heitmüller, his PhD candidate of the ERC funded project GlovTaxGov, and I will be the chair of this session as well as one of the speakers. And we are still waiting for Professor Julian Chase, professor at the City University of Hong Kong. So we will see, first we will have the first Professor Attiya Waris. Professor Attiya Waris, let me stop sharing and then I give the word to you. 1 second, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, from a very, very cold Nairobi. It is an honor and a pleasure to be there. Irma, if you can just confirm that you can see my screen and you can hear me clearly. Irma?
Sorry, I can see it very well.
Super. Thank you. All right. So, well, good morning, everybody. So just a quick exclusion clause. I am not speaking today in my capacity as a UN independent expert on foreign debt, only in my capacity as a professor of fiscal law and policy at the University of Nairobi in Kenya. And I've been asked to speak about the issue on tax justice in Europe and beyond. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about 4 main issues. The first is the issue of fiscal legitimacy and what that involves. The second is illicit financial flows and the impacts it has, not only in Europe, but of course in the rest of the world, with some reference to Africa. And then this very important area that tends to concern me quite a bit is the purpose of collection of taxation, and so tax policies and its links to issues around gender equality, while I will then conclude on the issue generally of tax justice and human rights at a broader level. So we need fairer systems. And I think fiscal legitimacy is a wonderful set of principles one can use to start to build a better system. And it has 7 principles. It's transparency, accountability, responsibility, effectiveness and efficiency, as well as fairness and justice. Now, these 7 principles become extremely important when you're trying to build a system that works for everybody. And if you look at tax systems and fiscal systems around the world, we continue to have compromises being made at political levels, in national states, but also regionally, continentally, as well as globally. And these compromises are continuing to undermine us. And the vulnerable, the people who are the poorest in our communities, are continuing to struggle in surviving. And this is why, for me, these principles of fiscal legitimacy are extremely important going forward. And it's what I use very often in my conversations. So there is a long and very difficult history with illicit financial flows. Data on illicit financial flows has been coming out from the 60s and 70s. But to date, we continue to allow cross-border movement of finances. And of course, with digitization, it is now easier and easier to have these cross-border movements of finances taking place, and it is excluding people. It's excluding those who are not on the global electronic systems, on the digital systems, are not on technological platforms. So that's already the creation of one layer of exclusion. And the second layer is the layer of exclusion where people are able to move their finances across borders without regulation. And it is and does tend to be those with more assets. So those without are now getting left behind more and more. And when you look at it at the level of nation states, the problem that continues to arise is that nations are now becoming more and more unequal and are starting to exclude each other more and more on different systems and in different ways. And it is a big cause of illicit financial flows where we are excluding each other and creating clubs. Now, there are 4 principles that you see taking place in illicit financial flows that tend to facilitate it and cause difficulties for the rest of the people in the world, as well as many states. The first is exclusion on the level of participation. If people are not participating in a global system where there are discussions or negotiations, then you have a problem. The second is access to information. A lot of the data that is housed digitally is not housed in all countries across the world, but is housed in specific countries where banks are located, where transactions are taking place, and accessing this information to assess what is moving from where to where, what business is taking place, and therefore, for example, what taxation should be assessed is continuing to be a problem and a challenge across the world. And then democracy, so excluding people from operating in democratic spaces continues to be a problem in trying to resolve some of the problems around illicit financial flows. And finally, I really appreciate this principle. It's a human rights principle, but it's also a tax principle, and that is about cooperation and technical assistance. We are pushing more and more in the direction of coordination and less to cooperation and assistance. And I think we need to move away from coordinating activities, which many institutions and entities are doing in negotiations, and move to cooperation and assistance while ensuring there is democracy, access to information, and participation in those spaces. Now, one cannot talk about illicit financial flows without reflecting on the issues of offshore tax havens, where the principle of secrecy, remember I mentioned access to information is a real concern, is what is allowing illicit financial flows to continue. And finally, it is hindering states from mobilizing maximal available resources for the realization of rights. And there are a huge number of documents that continue to reflect that not only are women excluded because we are not collecting enough taxation from illicit financial flows to fund access to them, to fund the ability to access social services, for example, but it is further undermining equality across the world. So these are my broad opening considerations. There are solutions to it. Some of the solutions include better coordinated mechanisms, but like I said, coordination has reached a certain point. It's now time to move to cooperation and assistance in a more serious and a more concrete level, but also global justice systems need to now kick into action because we need court cases to move faster. We need decisions made faster. We need money repatriated faster to countries that need it more. There is the famous ABC, which I will not mention in detail, but that is one of the solutions being provided across the world. Now, tax policies and gender equality are very important, and taxation is what is funding resources and services. It's also what we're taking away from people who are taxpayers who happen to be women. Now, there are both explicit and implicit problems of gender bias in the system, but I would like to point out that there are 3 areas that tend to be very gender heavy. I will use that in a very loose sense, because the COVID economy affected gendered issues much more than before and has exacerbated the problem, In addition, unpaid care work, which has also increased during the COVID period, which, let us please remember, is still ongoing in many developing countries, is continuing to be a heavy burden. And finally, the informal sector during COVID and now continuing in COVID is continuing to grow because more and more women are operating in that space. It has definite gender connections. So what are my recommendations? I think that coordination has reached its peak. I think we now need to actually have cooperation and assistance. I think that there have been a lot of calls for a world tax body, and continental tax bodies, I think, are as important as a world tax body, because there tend to be granular issues on taxation in the different continents that need to be dealt with much faster. But also, and I join this, the call for a global tax convention, which could include actually principles around the creation of a world tax body. But also keeping in mind always that for us to have a fair and just system, tax system, we must make sure that the taxes are collected for a purpose. And the purpose, I believe, is actually human rights. And human rights principles and the Sustainable Development Goals are an excellent measure of how to allocate finances. And so I would recommend for a human rights lens in approaching the tax justice issues. I thank you very much for your time. Irma, back to you.
Thank you so much, Attiya. I think that It's wonderful to have you as a presenter because you are amazing, but also you touch all the points that we need to discuss here in tax justice. And I think that from the work that we do in illicit financial flows, but also the work on taxation, I think two things are left with me that, and it's very interesting that you say is, let's look through the human right lens. Let's look at also as the SDGs. So my question to you is how we can measure, how we can use those SDGs, for instance, because I know there is a lot of work now that is doing with the Sustainable Development Goals, but how we can use these SDGs as a measurement to obtain more tax justice. Perhaps you can react on that question. Hopefully it's not too complicated. Attiya, we lost you.
Broke off. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Sorry about that. Okay. Thank you very much, Irma. It's always a pleasure to have a conversation with you. I think that there's two ways of approaching the SDGs and human rights generally. But I think also because a lot of people working in tax never engaged as much with the Millennium Development Goals, I think a really good starting point for tax specifically is to go and look at the Millennium Development Goals first. And the reason I say that is because, for example, the Millennium Development Goals would state very concretely that you need access to water within a circumference of somebody's home. Now, this was a very real concept. It didn't say tap water in people's houses. It said, within a certain distance. Now, from a tax perspective and a government revenue perspective, it's easy to measure that at a granular level on the ground because you can go and check how much it's going to cost to lay those pipes and to get the water or to put rain harvesting on roofs. So if we can measure those financially, then when we now look at the taxation part of it, you're basically now already able to see how you're going to spend it. So that's the one part of it. But also at the same time, if you look at, and the one I'm using is rainwater, is if you're looking at climate protection issues, then you can already see that being able to harvest rainwater is a very environmentally friendly approach. So taking that and measuring the benefit to the environment of using this very climate-friendly technique on the one hand, but on the other hand also being able to give people a tax break for something like that, for example. And then on the other hand, seeing how they're accessing the right to water because the government has put that in place. And traditionally, tax systems would look at it as social services, a water system in place, that you have water in your household. But in many developing countries, water in the household isn't yet a reality. So for me, this is why I think Millennium Development Goals that seem to have sort of been forgotten in a sense, but were never achieved actually, is a very good starting point for us in tax justice. And then if I move to the Sustainable Development Goals, then this is where illicit financial flows kicks in. Having spaces where we are debating and discussing the movement of money and ensuring that if a particular country is producing a certain amount of profit based on a company's activities, that they can fairly tax it. And then I mean, for me, fairness and justice is important for the taxpayer as much as it is for the state, as much as it is for the beneficiary of the taxation that is being collected. And I think if we keep that in mind, this sort of human-centered approach, I think can make things a lot easier for all of us, especially when we're neck deep in debating multilateral tax treaties and we lose that focus sometimes. So yes, thank you, Irma.
I think, Attiya, this is really great, and I'm happy that it's being recorded because one of the things that we really have is that we need to have a broader picture and not only talking about tax administration, domestic resource mobilization, but we are talking also about all the problems here. Thank you so much for this. I will now give the word to Frederik Heitmüller. We have looked now from the perspective of what happens in tax justice. We have set up the scene for the Africa. And let's look now at the work of taxation directly regarding also BEPS, the base erosion profit shifting, and regarding developing countries. And that will be Frederik, who is a PhD in the ERC funded, European Research Council funded project GloveTaxGov that investigates global tax governance. So Frederik, I give the word to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Right, let me share. Can you see everyone? Can everybody
we can see it. We can see it.
I cannot see you anymore, unfortunately, but I know that you are there. So
yes,
yeah,
we are.
In my presentation, it goes a little bit more into the technical details of corporate taxation, but I think that there's a link to two issues Attiya mentioned in her presentation. So the one is the issue of coordination. Attiya, you mentioned that yeah, we need more assistance, more cooperation, but maybe less coordination in taxes. But you also mentioned that we have this problem of offshore tax havens. So what I'm going to talk about in my presentation is a specific tool of global governance, namely the European Union's list of non-cooperative jurisdictions and tax matters, which yeah, is basically a list of countries, a tax haven blacklist that was set up with the objective to tackle tax fraud, evasion and avoidance, and to address external challenges to the tax bases of EU countries. So yeah, what the European Union did in 2016, 2017 was to come up with a list of criteria of what aspects of countries' laws or countries' practices would make them non-cooperative jurisdictions, and which would then trigger defensive measures. So all this with the goal of yeah, fighting this problem of offshore tax havens and related problems that arise because of the existence of tax havens. And the criteria that have been used for this list are exchange of information, so that countries exchange information, fair taxation, which basically relates to the fact that taxpayers need to have a substance that countries do not use, legal regimes that attract taxpayers without substance in the country, only with the purpose of helping to avoid taxes elsewhere. And then the base erosion and profit shifting minimum standards, 4 minimum standards. There's some talks that potentially in the future the new work by the OECD on digital taxes, the Pillar 1 and the global minimum tax, Pillar 2, could be included in the criteria of these lists. And if a country is placed on this list, then the member states of the European Union are prompted to use certain measures, certain defensive measures. So this can includes increased audits of taxpayers that have transactions with countries that are on the list. That can mean higher withholding taxes for payments that taxpayers make to countries on the list. That can mean denying deductions or limiting deductions for payments to countries on this list, or limiting participation exemption, so an exemption from taxation of funds that taxpayers receive from countries on this list. There are also some non-tax measures, such as, for example, not concluding broader economic agreements such as trade agreements, also with countries on the list. So overall, it's quite a forceful tool, I would say, in theory, but it has received a lot of criticism by civil society organizations, by academics, but also by countries that have been placed on the list or that could be placed on the list. So one is the compliance burden for these countries with complying technically with the criteria, because it demands a lot of administrative resources, for example, to exchange information or to comply with these policy standards. Another criticism was unequal application of the criteria on the list, so that major powers such as the US or even the EU member states themselves were not treated equally in the application of the criteria, and that only smaller third countries in the end ended up on this list of tax havens, although other countries also had problematic practices and also lack of procedural transparency in the elaboration of the list. I'm not going to go further into these points, but here the point I want to make is that during the work I'm doing on my PhD, which is not so much on this EU topic, but much more on these BEPS minimum standards, which is one part of the criteria. During this work, I noted that there's actually a mismatch between the objectives of the list, the inclusion of this specific criterion, and the defensive tax measures that are contemplated. So on the next slide, I just went a little bit into detail. So these 4 BEPS minimum standards, they ask countries different things. I hope that everybody here is roughly familiar with with how this came about. So all the BEPS project was about multinational enterprises avoiding taxes in different countries, corporate taxes, and so then the OECD came up with a number of recommendations, but also 4 basic policy standards that countries should implement in order to address this problem. And so what I basically did is that I thought about what would actually non-compliance by non-EU countries, so by these third countries, what kind of problem could this mean for the EU member states? And I found that for some of these standards, it could indeed mean a loss of tax revenue, loss of tax base for the EU member states. So, for example, if a third country doesn't comply with the standards of BEPS Action 5 or maybe BEPS Action 6, but that actually non-compliance with the other standards could often actually mean different things. So if, for example, another country doesn't comply with the criteria of the BEPS Action 13 on country-by-country reporting relating to not implementing privacy and appropriate use safeguards, this could actually be problematic for EU member states, but not in terms of a loss of tax revenue for them, but rather that multinational enterprises headquartered in the EU that invest in third countries abroad could face higher taxation there than under standards, or they could face competitive problems if, for example, their information becomes public, but not the information of domestic competitors, for example. And same for BEPS Section 14, which is actually not about raising tax revenue as such, but rather about nudging countries to resolve disputes between tax administrations faster, also with the objective of preventing double taxation, but not really preventing losses of tax revenue. So actually, what does it mean? On the one hand, there are these BEPS minimum standards have been included as criteria on the blacklist of tax haven, but they don't all entirely relate to the problems of tax loss that tax havens create. So if a country is not complying, a third country is not complying with parts of these standards, that does not always actually mean that there's a threat of loss of tax revenue to EU member states or even to other countries. And then if in such a case, a country, the EU member state was to apply defensive tax measures, such as those that I mentioned earlier, this would actually not really solve the problem, but rather exacerbate it. So if the problem caused by non-compliance for the EU is that EU MNEs face higher taxation than maybe MNEs of other countries abroad. If you then apply the kinds of tax measures that were that the EU list foresees, then this would lead to even a higher tax burden than before. This is one, and the other one is that for some of the non-compliance problems that were mentioned, that I mentioned, where there could actually be a loss of tax revenue, the BEPS actions already foresee what countries can do in that case. So for example, if a third country were not to accept including an anti-avoidance rule in their treaties with member states, then the defensive measures put by the list would not actually be that effective, because they would be probably illegal under the treaty. But the EU member state could simply take another measure, such as terminate the treaties with the country, just as an example. So finally, I thought a little bit about what about these new projects by the OECD, the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 projects. Should they be included in the criteria in the future? And there I found that the situation is relatively similar. So non-compliance by third countries could often actually mean that that there's not really a loss of tax revenue risk for EU member states, but rather a loss of competitiveness maybe for EU business and third country markets, if the EU, for example, puts in place Pillar 2, but not another country, like for example China or the US. This could mean that EU MNEs have disadvantages compared to MNEs from China, for example, but it would not necessarily mean a loss of tax revenue in the for the EU. So there again, like putting in place this kinds of defensive measures might not necessarily resolve these problems. And again, such as under the BEPS actions, some the solutions what the EU can do if another country does not comply are already inbuilt, so to say, in the rules. So Pillar 2 is all about allowing a country to tax if another country does not tax. So the defensive measure, so to say, is already inbuilt in the proposal. Just to conclude from that, I think, like, based on this analysis, I think the list of non-cooperative jurisdictions by the EU can be somewhat improved if compliance with these BEPS standards was to be removed from the criteria of the list of non-cooperative jurisdictions, except maybe for the criteria related to harmful tax practices, such as lack of exchange of tax rulings. But for the rest, they don't necessarily relate to the problem that the list seeks to address. And a priori, the same goes for the new policy standards that are developed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Frederik. I think that both of you, Attiya and you, have presented what developing countries are facing, what the problems are, but also looking at from different perspectives. So first of all, what is needed, how we link it to the illicit money flows, to the sustainable development goals, to the human rights, but at the same time, looking at the technicality, what we are asking developing countries to do. We know that, for instance, this BEPS project and the BEPS for minimum standards are being now followed by 141 tax jurisdictions around the world. That means more than half of the population of the countries around the world, and that means that it brings a lot of attention. What I would like to focus in the next presentation, what I will give is the role of the European Union, because we are talking about tax justice, EU and beyond, but we are also looking at this role of the European Union like I don't think that in my position as one of the EU Jamonet chair on EU tax governance, I don't think that in this role the European Union has taken into account all the needs, the considerations of developing countries. So I will show you more or less the reason why Frederik was mentioning about the BEPS and the compliance with the BEPS for minimum standards, the list of non-cooperative jurisdictions, and I will look at also how this has been included in agreements concluded between the European Union and countries, including African countries. So let me share my slides. And now will be the one who will be asking, can you see me? But wait a second, because I haven't shared the slides yet. So if you see, no.
Not yet.
And now you can see me, right? And you can see the slides.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So what we are going to talk about today is whether I think the European Union is still following the roadmap that we need to have to achieve tax justice. And my idea is that actually it is not. However, the European Union always mentions about what it means to have tax justice, we have tax good governance, we have fairness of the tax systems. What does it mean? And I think that the presentation given by Attiya gave us a lot of, by Professor Waris gave us a lot of food for thought and say, well, let's take a step back and let's not look at only what the other countries are doing, but let's look also what the countries will need. One of the things that is important is that the European Union, as much as the other international organizations, such as the OECD and political forums like the G20, want to improve international tax cooperation, want to promote fair taxation, sustainability, and at the same time, they say, well, we want to support the BEPS project, a smooth and timely implementation in the single market and internationally. We already know what the BEPS project is. It's about the base erosion profit shifting project to tackle aggressive tax planning, profit shifting by multinationals. But what we see is that the EU says, well, how we are going to achieve this fairness of the tax system. So we are going to ask, or we're going to introduce that the parties will recognize and commit to implement the principles of good governance in the tax area that include transparency, exchange of information, fair taxation, and the minimum standards against base erosion profit shifting. This standard of good governance in tax matter has been included, and it is included in the agreements, strategic partnership agreements, trade agreements with the EU. The role of this EU tax governance Monnet chair is to raise awareness of the use of this standard, and also to create a dialogue between academia, civil society, governments of this standard. What we see is that this standard did not started. It started only in 2008, approximately after the financial crisis. And the European Union said at that moment, let's talk about transparency, exchange of information, and fair tax competition. And for that purpose, they also created in 2012 the list of non-cooperative jurisdictions. So either way was the carrot and the stick. So if we have this standard of good governance, the carrot, and you introduce it in your agreements, then we will have in your trade agreements, strategic partnership agreements, I will give you these agreements. But if you don't, then I put you in the list of non-cooperative jurisdictions with all the consequences that will have. Later on in 2018, following also the BEPS project, they decided we are going to introduce the BEPS for minimum standards. Frederik has already mentioned to you that actually these BEPS or minimum standards, except for the change of rulings, should not be included in this standard of good governance in tax matters. What happens then, the Commission will say, well, we are going to have this standard of good governance and we are going to update it in all the ongoing negotiations. And we are going to make sure that, remember the stick, in the event that a third country refuses to accept the clause, or insists on changing it to the extent that it no longer serves the intended purpose, so this standard of good governance, the Commission and Member States must consider the appropriate response. Such countries could be scrutinized under the EU listing exercise. So again, what happens then is that we have this standard of good governance in tax matters. We are talking about transparency, exchange of information, fair taxation, BEPS, and this standard of good governance in tax matters will be included in international agreements, either trade, either strategic partnership agreements, and if the country does not refuse to accept it, the country will be scrutinized under the EU listing exercise. And that means then that, of course, a lot of investments that will go to those countries that are in the list of non-cooperative jurisdictions will not be taking place. But the EU says, and we're talking about 2020. So we started in 2008 and we are talking now 2020, and we are saying tax good governance is the foundation on which fair taxation is built. Broadly, tax good governance encompasses tax transparency, fair tax competitions, the absence of harmful tax measures, and the application of international agreed standards. But we already know that these international agreed standards, in this case, the BEPS project, is not really so international, is not really so needed. There are differences between countries, and that's also what Frederik was mentioned. But we see that in this case, well, we say the standard can be introduced in a legally binding framework for cooperation, a strategic partnership agreement, as a coordinated clause in free trade agreements, and of course, as any other relevant agreements, but also in issues such as aid and cooperation. When we look at this standard and we say, well, how this standard with this fair taxation, fairness of the tax system, sustainability, what does it mean that? Does this mean something for developing countries? That this means, like, for instance, Professor Waris mentioned about sustainable development goals, start with Millennium Development Goals, go to sustainable development goals. Does this mean that we are really addressing all the needs of the countries? Or is simply the European Union and the European Commission introducing this standard and saying, this is what I think that you should do, and just do it, because otherwise you will be in the list of non-cooperative jurisdictions. When we look at this standard, and then we look very short to the agreements, we see that this standard has been implemented differently. So we have in South Korea, talks only about fair tax competition, exchange of information and transparency. Interesting enough, we also, for instance, have in Japan, in this strategic partnership agreement, that is linked to a trade agreement. We have exchange of information, harmful tax, transparency. We look at Philippines, and they say the good governance in the tax area. Philippines, in this partnership and cooperation agreement that is linked to under negotiation trade agreement, only talks about good governance in the tax area. So it means that, as was mentioned by Frederik before, this good governance in tax area could not only entail at this moment what we have: transparency, exchange of information, fair tax systems, and BEPS, but it could be anything. So it could be also, let's go for this minimum tax. It's also good governance in the tax area. But the question is, again, how this will help the countries. And it's interesting to see that here says, with a view to strengthening and developing economic activities. The countries will commit to the principle of good governance in tax area. When we look at then at the other agreements, for instance, with China, we only talk about the exchange of information. Of course, this agenda for cooperation. With free trade agreement with Colombia and Peru, we talk also about the exchange of information. But when we look at the ACP agreements, and actually this is very interesting, because in the ACP, the European, African, Caribbean, and Pacific negotiations that concluded in 15 April 21, they say, well, there is already a negotiated agreement, and they say, the parties recognize and commit themselves to implementing principles of good governance in tax area. So that means transparency, exchange of information, fair taxation, and BEPS. What is interesting to see, they say also they shall promote good governance, they shall cooperate to enhance capacity, and they agree to engage in timely partnership. But the question, and as Attiya mentioned to us, this is the discussion also about tax justice. What does it mean this? Does this mean also, for instance, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals? Or we are just introducing these international standards of transparency, exchange of information, and BEPS without really having clear what is in for these countries? And don't get me started with fair taxation, because fair taxation is a concept that is put here, but actually has not been defined by the European Commission. So this project of the AU Jamonet Chair that receives funding from the AU Erasmus Plus program has also been able to raise and to discuss the awareness of this standard. And with this, I will stop sharing so we have some discussion for the meeting. So let me see. And perhaps I went a little too fast, but I think that I'm more interested about hearing your thoughts about it, because I think that, Professor Waris, I think that you may have very interesting things about this standard of tax good governance, and then after I will give the word to Frederik. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Irma. I always find it very interesting. And I think, and I feel that whenever I hear discussions around BEPS, that there's this presumption that the phrase base erosion and profit shifting in the English language is the same as the base erosion and profit shifting project at the OECD. And I think that it's so important to distinguish the two. Because, for example, base erosion and profit shifting does take place in the extractive sector. But the negotiated base erosion and profit shifting project at the OECD excludes the extractive sector. I think we sometimes jump over it and then don't realize that it's not what it seems. And I think for me, this is where I wish the European Commission would separate itself from what the OECD is working on and work on what the EU as a regional bloc should work on. Because there is a lot of mining and extractives that they are involved in. For example, this is just one example. And I think to narrow themselves down only to the OECD approach is to lose that whole bigger picture. And then if you add in this lens of tax justice that we're trying to work on, it's also tax justice for Europeans, right? So what about those ones engaged in the mining sector in Europe? And I think separating those two and then being able to address them becomes very important. So that's the first thing that struck me with when I listened. But I was fascinated. So good tax governance, I think, is unfortunate. So governance, generally, good governance includes transparency, accountability, and responsibility as the three core principles. And this is the global definition of good governance. But the European Commission has now distilled tax governance to include those three things, which is interesting. So why have they left out the rest? Like, why have they not looked at issues around responsibility in more clarity? Again, separating and trying to understand why it's taking on this approach and not a different approach, for me, would be quite fascinating. But I am reminded that the 31 least developing countries are not part of the processes, and that even while we talk about good governance, and I like the examples that you gave, Irma, but I would be curious to know what they're doing in their negotiations specifically with those 31 LDCs, because the phrases that you see popping out can be very telling. I think it was in 2018, I did a piece of research looking at African constitutions and their provision on the power or the right to tax. And I found it very interesting when I did a correlation between that and how they were now doing their spending. In the language they used on how they collect from their people versus now how they're spending. And you start to see that countries with stronger governments as human beings, but not necessarily governance structures, have stronger principles in constitutions. And I think this phrases in treaties, I think could be a fantastic process if we can see what they're doing across the world and then unpack why they're doing that. Like, what's the instruction the treaty negotiator is being given when they go into the room that is resulting in these different sets of phrases? And is there a policy at the EU level where they have a different type of clause for different types of countries and why they have it? I think without judging them, because I don't think it's necessarily a negative. It could be that they feel that that particular country couldn't set up those provisions on automatic exchange, for example. So then you put in a broader phrase. So you're still in line with your policy at a regional level in Europe, but you're still able to negotiate the treaty. I mean, for me, those would be very interesting nuances to unpack. But yes, I wish they would talk about human rights somewhere, because I think that is so important as well. Thanks.
And I think that I completely agree with you, Attiya, because I think that if we really look at this broader perspective and we look at this is about human rights, this is about sustainable development, this is a start with the Millennium Development Goals, this is about illicit money flows, then we can perhaps say this is not only about what the OECD says, let's look at transparency, exchange of information and BEPS, but let's look at what really the countries would need. And if we are saying illicit money flows, for instance, would be a very good example that you should put in this standard of tax good governance. Definitely. I believe, I mean, I'm making a case for the work you are doing in illicit money flows, but I think that this is very important. And I know that, for instance, there is an African tax initiative where they say, well, exchange of information and illicit money flows. But it will have been interesting if the European Commission will also take this into account in these standards, especially with the ACP, the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, the recent agreement, where they talk about fairness of the tax systems, the modern tax systems, but when they go to tax, they still keep with the same. Instead of saying, Africa has this problem, let's address it. Let's put it in the African, Caribbean, and Pacific agreement. It's a lost opportunity, in my view.
Yeah, but I think it's worthwhile us elaborating it for them. I mean, I think the project is in a really good place to do that. So being able to turn around and say, what would automatic exchange look like? What should transparency look like? So you've got it in the treaty, but where's the accountability around it? How do we know these things are taking place? I think this is something where if we can push countries to reflect on, I think would be fantastic. But I'm sure
really great
to jump in. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Frederik, I give you the word to you because you were also mentioning it in your conclusions that how do you see this? We have like 2-3 minutes to give you some comments because I know Attiya has to leave.
Yeah.
Please, Frederik.
No, I wanted to ask Attiya, I wanted to ask you actually something like, do you think it like the fact that these clauses are included there, I'm not so sure if it's necessarily need to be negative. Also, do you think there's maybe space for countries also to exploit the fact that the EU wants to put in these clauses and say maybe, okay, we want to do automatic information exchange, we want to do these things, but yeah, we need your help implementing this. We need like funds for putting these things in place, for purchasing the IT software, whatever. Do you think that countries are doing that, or that there could be more space so that countries are doing that? Sorry, it was less a comment than a question.
I'm not sure if Attiya heard the whole comment.
I don't know.
No, sorry, I didn't hear it. I'm sorry, my connection went off a little bit.
Okay. No,
Sorry.
I wanted to ask you if you think that there's maybe more space for countries to exploit these kinds of agreements and say, like if you want to have these clauses in it, we need more funds, for example, for putting in place the IT, for doing automatic information exchange, or is this already done, or yeah, what do you think?
I think it's a very interesting idea. I haven't heard of it being a negotiation tactic in developing countries, but I also think that so Europe and the rest of the world, that's like another 150 countries. It's not one big mass. I think that for countries that are more developed, I think they probably do try and analyze those, and I think that's why they become more detailed. I think that's why things are left out. But when you look at emerging countries, sometimes I don't know if they are aware of the processes, and I wonder what is said during negotiations. Because if I walk into a negotiation and I say, oh yeah, but this just means the OECD stuff and you've already signed on to it, so don't worry about it, it's not a big deal. I mean, if that's the conversation that they're having in the room, then it wouldn't matter. But when you look at the least developing countries, so the 31 of them, I'm thinking, yeah, this could be a really good entry point for them to get access to funding to fulfill those things. And I think that's why in my earlier comment, I said maybe we should be unpacking what that looks like, so that when any country goes into the room, maybe we need, I don't know, an LDC primer on what to ask for currently if you're going into negotiations in the European Union or European Commission countries, or even the US. And I think that those sort of global tax discussions can be really powerful for treaty negotiators. I mean, Kenya this year has, for the first time ever, actually released publicly its national tax policy. And then that's Kenya that is supposed to be a lot further ahead than most other countries on tax debates and discussions. It's the first time ever I've seen it. So if that's the pace they are at, the countries, if you want to now peg other countries accordingly, but you start to see how much of a challenge it is. And I think a link to national tax policies could be very interesting as well there.
Thank you so much, Attiya. I think that this gives us kind of the end, but I think that that's what is important, that we need to think and reconsider everything what we are talking about tax policy, what we are talking about international agreements and link it to tax justice and what does it mean. But I think it gave us a lot of food for thought, but also some material. Actually, we should be organizing another meeting and having all tax administrations from Africa, Latin America, and I mean Caribbean, and discuss about this topic. So definitely we will go back to that. Thank you so much for being here, Professor Waris. I say Attiya because I know you very well, but Professor Waris is one of the leader researchers in Africa, if I may say that. So it's kind of interesting to see all the views that you are having also in your personal capacity, and as a researcher, as a tax scholar. And I think that we have a lot of work to do. Thank you so much. And with this, I will conclude the session. Unfortunately, Julian Chase could not join, even though he was not in Hong Kong. He was in France at this moment. There were problems with the logging in, so that can happen. But we will invite him for another time. So thank you so much. And for everyone who will watch later on this recording, you can also look at in the project that we do in Glove TaxGov at Leiden University, funded by the European Research Council and the EU Jean Monnet Chair on EU tax governance. And we will continue with these discussions. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Waris, for being here. Thank you to Frederik for also being available and for giving his presentation. So thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.